So we're coming to you with a very formal look today. There are no dog shirts in sight. There are two blazers, and two collared shirts, although they are distributed among three people.
Ben is gone. The suits are out. This is going to be no funny business today.
When our editor is not in court, we dress up.
Yeah,
So
the opposite of what you would think. Our
yeah.
boss is gone, so we're putting on our best behavior. We usually have to put on our worst.
Well, with that, welcome everybody to a live recording of Trump's Trials and Tribulations, a New York Trial Dispatch. Today is May 9th, and I'm Quinta Jurecic, Senior Editor. I am joined by Courts Correspondent and Legal Fellow Anna Bauer and Managing Editor Tyler McBrien. And we are dog shirtless today, so we will just all have to do our best Benjamin Wittes impression. So it was a busy day today, and there were some fireworks right at the end. So I think rather than asking you to go chronologically, um, let's just jump straight to kind of the meat of the story, which really I think took place at the beginning and end, with Stormy Daniels' continued testimony on cross-examination and then redirect. And then an unsuccessful motion for a mistrial at the end of the hearing. So let's start with Stormy. We left off the other day with some, I think, pretty grueling testimony from her on direct examination, describing her interaction with Trump in 2006. And then a also pretty grueling start to the cross-examination by Trump's lawyer, Susan Nicholas, which continued today. So what happened?
Yeah, so there was actually, in terms of the atmosphere around the court, it was actually the day that had the most air of anticipation, maybe even more so than opening statements. Tyler showed up. I was in the courtroom in our reserve seat. Tyler had the unfortunate assignment of being in the overflow room today, which meant that he had to get there especially early. And when he showed up, there was actually a line like way down the block. In recent days, it actually has not been that bad. You can show up at 7:30, 7:45 and still get in. But luckily, Tyler did get the golden ticket and he got into the overflow room. I got into the courtroom. We had some special guests there today. Rick Scott, the U.S. Senator, was there, as well as some familiar faces, including Alina Habba and Boris Epstein. And then also in the back of the room, this was very interesting. Harvey Weinstein's attorney, Idela, is that how you say his last name?
I believe so.
Okay.
Sure.
He was in the back of the courtroom speaking with Andrew Giuliani, who is the son of Rudy Giuliani. And so it was just very interesting to see, a number of new faces in the courtroom. People were scrambling around trying to get the best seats. So it was very much a high anticipation for the continuation of this cross-examination. I last week wasn't able to, or excuse me, on Tuesday, wasn't able to join the discussion that we had after Stormy Daniels did her direct and then also did her cross-examination. So I was really excited and interested, although I saw the direct on Tuesday. I was very excited to see some of this cross-examination because hearing, for example, Ben's take on the podcast, it sounded like the defense had made some gains, it seemed like, in terms of kind of attacking Stormy Daniels' credibility. But in fact, my take on it, when we got into the cross-examination today, is that any ground that they may have gained on Tuesday, they lost and then some today. Stormy Daniels, I mean, on direct on Tuesday, she struck me as very credible. She was funny. She was relatable. She told a very powerful story about this power imbalance that she experienced in this sexual encounter that she had with Trump in 2006. Unlike Ben, I actually found it to be very fitting in terms of the prosecution choosing to put her on, because it relates to the narrative about the Access Hollywood tape being this event that meant that Trump had this motive or intent to take means to falsify records in order to cover up the payment to Stormy Daniels for her silence. And the Access Hollywood tape, if folks remember, everyone remembers the, grab them by their whatever comment. But it also, one of the reasons that I think it was so offensive and striking to people in that tape is that Trump says, when you're a star, they let you do it. And so there is at its core this idea in that tape that there's these power imbalances between Trump and women that he is intentionally taking advantage of. And that is why I think listening to Stormy Daniels on Tuesday, it was very powerful because it connected to that kind of relationship in which there's nothing that is an allegation of sexual assault, but there certainly is something there that I think, they might have more of a motive to want to cover that up because of the way that it connects to that underlying kind of theme within the Access Hollywood comments. So all of that said, today, again, struck me as a day in which the defense seemed to lose ground. Susan Necklace, I always say her name wrong, so sorry to Susan Necklace. Susan Necklace resumed her cross-examination. And I think, Quinta, the point that, and I want to hear Tyler's thoughts on this, so I will stop talking after I get around to this, but what struck me the most from this cross-examination today is when Susan Necklace started to get into that conversation about, or those comments that Stormy Daniels made about the power imbalance within that sexual encounter, she started asking her questions that were to the effect of, you are in the adult entertainment industry, you've seen over 200 men and women naked. You've acted in films with them. You've had sex on camera. You've made up stories about sex on camera, those kinds of things. And then all of it was getting to this idea that, you are act in porn films, and yet you said on Tuesday that you were shocked and that you had a jump scare moment whenever you saw a man in a t-shirt and boxers laying on a bed in front of you when you exited the bathroom. It struck me as an actually really disgusting moment. I was offended by it because it struck me as
it's essentially, what did you think wearing a skirt that was that short?
Exactly. Well, it was like an old school, defending a client against a rape charge, in the 80s strategy. It was very weird. It felt very like not of this time, and it just did not connect at all. I mean, I can't see into the minds of the jurors, so I don't know if maybe there were jurors that it connected with, but that to me was where things really started to go wrong, and I just don't think that there were other things that they really scored a lot of points with today in terms of other aspects of, the subject matter. But I will now finally hand it over to Tyler to discuss what he thought.
No, I agree with all of that. And I agree. It did seem like a shift at that point in the questioning. I wasn't actually in the courtroom for that moment, so I'd be curious if you noticed any reactions from the jury, but it did feel like a very retrograde style argument. And I think having seen the jury now, some of them are younger. I think the jury now in 2024 probably has a more nuanced view of sexual assault and consent that was probably didn't really play well with them. But I will say also, not only did the defense lose ground by making themselves look bad, I think, with this line of questioning, and losing ground on this image of Stormy Daniels as this sort of aggressor, extortionist type figure, she also took it with aplomb. She turned these things around into these really funny one-liners, honestly. I pulled one up just so I had it at the ready. So the question was essentially that, Necklace was asking her, you've bragged in the past about being good at writing dialogue and sex scenes in adult films, right? And she said, if that story with Trump was untrue, I would have written it a lot better. And she delivers it like a punchline. And I was quite impressed, honestly. She was strong yesterday, but she was even stronger today. And so not only did she withstand these attacks, I thought she turned it around. She almost, judo moved it back at Necklace, and did it well.
Yeah, and some of the other things that they were trying to get in cross-examination, I mean, they tried to get her to say or to imply that there were differences or inconsistencies in the stories that at the different points in time that she's told her story about her sexual encounter with Trump. So they brought up a number of different interviews. There's one from 2011 with In Touch magazine. There's the Anderson Cooper interview that she did later on, and then there's, of course, just other statements she's made on Twitter, or she's gone on podcasts and that kind of thing. So they tried to focus on some of these inconsistencies or omissions. But again, it didn't quite land with me, although I'm interested to see what Tyler thought. In part because Stormy Daniels actually, she's someone who's very media savvy, in the sense that she has experience working in media. She knows how an audience will kind of receive things. And so she knows that there's different publications that do different types of things. So Anderson Cooper is going to be doing one thing, Jimmy Kimmel will be doing another, that kind of thing. And when they were asking her, why didn't you say in your In Touch interview X, Y, and Z? She was saying, well, look, it's a frivolous a celebrity kind of tabloid magazine, so I'm not going to give all of these details. I was kind of told to be a little bit more vague and not mention specific things and that kind of thing. And then also on redirect, the prosecution was able to elicit that at the bottom of the article, for example, it said that the interview had been edited. And that's very common, again, because often for clarity and for space reasons, if someone gives an interview, what actually publishes is often not the entire interview. So there was a lot of kind of explaining to the jurors exactly how that kind of stuff works. And I think that was relatively effective. That's not to say, though, that there aren't things that I think she pushed back on. There are some inconsistencies and things she said at different points over the years. She herself has said that she, started to remember or reflect on things differently as time went on. So again, I'm not suggesting that there aren't inconsistencies, but to me, some of this cross-examination lines of argument, or not argument, lines of inquiry just didn't really hit the way that I think that Trump's team wanted it to.
Yeah, I would just say, I think a lot of the inconsistencies that Necklace was trying to pinpoint had logical explanations. And I think we should also step back and remember that this is quite a traumatic incident in Daniel's retelling. And as with traumatic incidents, there will be inconsistencies, different memories. She said she blacked out, blood was rushing to her head, the room was spinning. Though this wasn't explicitly said, it seemed to be the subtext of some of the inconsistencies as well. And I think overall today, I can't really think of any sort of gotcha moment that the defense had on Daniels. There was another line of inquiry about tweets that Daniels was replying to random strangers on the internet, essentially, sort of trying to paint Daniels almost like a Trumpian, in my telling, like a Trumpian figure, just picking random fights with non-celebrities as a celebrity. But she had the defense of, I was defending myself. These were attacks on my character, and I was doing what anyone else would do.
Yeah, and I will say that I did think that one area that I found it's, to me, it just kind of doesn't really matter, but it does. I can see how maybe some jurors would look at some of the lines of questioning about the tweets that she was making after the indictment, in which she was saying things like, basically indictment special for the next 45 hours, which, because Trump is the 45th president, for the next 45 hours, everyone will receive a free gift if they buy something from my site. She had things she was selling on her site that were, things like the patron saint of indictments, Stormy Daniels candle.
Like a saint candle, yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a good moment because she turned it back and also made, they were like, well, what you were excited about this indictment, and she had another really great quip when she said, oh, I can't remember, there were a lot of indictments, which
Yeah.
also I thought was like, it was funny, obviously, but it sort of depersonalized, Trump's unfair treatment, in the courts from herself. This is not the only case that's happened. It is the only one in trial, but it's not the only indictment that Trump is facing. So I think that was also a good reminder.
Yeah, and what they were trying to get. Oh, I'm sorry, Quinta. Go ahead.
So one point that I wanted to raise, and I do want to make sure that we go to the mistrial next, is the question of whether Necklace is making these arguments because of her client, essentially, in the same way that, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the mistrial, it seems like it was potentially a mistake for Blanche to outright call Daniels a liar in her account of her interaction with Trump. That Necklace is really digging in on all of these aspects of Daniels's testimony that are very uncomfortable for Trump, sort of trying to suggest that she's a liar and so on and so forth. I did wonder, because it really seems like that was not the best trial strategy, whether that might be something that Trump himself had demanded. We know that he's been aggressive with his lawyers and feeling like they're not defending him enough. I'm curious what you think about that.
It's hard to say. You never know. I will say there are things that are like classic, trial advocacy. Like, of course, you're going to try to impeach for bias and motive and that kind of thing. So, of course, you're going to try to elicit some questions about prior inconsistent statements. I do think, and we'll get to some of this in the mistrial, but I think though maybe one of the biggest questions about trial strategy that's come up today is just the question of whether it was a good trial strategy to try to attack this credibility of Stormy Daniels in particular, as opposed to maybe really going after Keith Davidson as they did about being, him being this aggressive entertainment lawyer with this history of extortionate conduct and that kind of thing. And then, maybe not not putting Stormy's credibility so much into question as they have, because it seems to have really come back to bite them in important ways in which we will discuss when we get to the motion for mistrial. But I think, Quinta, I don't know, but I think maybe there's a mix of both client control and pleasing your client, that kind of thing. And then also, some of it actually makes sense from an advocacy perspective, because it is just the kind of classic thing that you would do, where if a witness is tweeting out a bunch of stuff saying they hate your client, then of course you're going to present that to try to show that they're biased against your client.
I will say one more funny moment of Daniels, where there was a tweet that she had said something about an orange turd, and Necklace said, I'm sorry to have to bring this up, but Necklace said, I can't believe you, something like, I can't believe you would, tweet that about Trump, and Daniels essentially quipped like, I didn't say it was about Trump, that was your interpretation, which is stupid and childish, but actually was kind of funny.
All right. Well, with that, let us discuss the mistrial motion. So this is actually the second motion for a mistrial when it comes to Stormy Daniels' testimony. We had another one on Tuesday. So what exactly was Trump's legal team arguing, and were they any more successful this time around?
I would say, to answer your second question first, no. To dispel with the suspense. And in fact, I think they were even less successful, even though it was a binary no. But they were essentially saying that much of what Daniels was talking about was new, and it was also, extremely prejudicial. It was not probative. It was salacious. These are all, I believe, very repetitive arguments. But I think this also, the most interesting part of it to me was when Steinglass stood up for the prosecution. And just briefly, I thought he had this really great line where he said, the defense is trying to obviously, destroy Daniels' credibility by saying that this entire encounter didn't take place, and which gives then the prosecution a right to rehabilitate her credibility. And he had this great response where he said that the defense is trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to discredit Daniels, that her story is false, and then preclude the prosecution from eliciting the very details that would corroborate her story. which I thought was very powerful. And Justice Merchan seemed to agree with that. Before his ruling, I wasn't there for the exact ruling, but he was essentially saying, the defense opened the door to this from the very beginning, from the opening statements. They attacked Daniels' credibility, and while the prosecution doesn't have to prove that the sexual encounter occurred at all, they do have a right to rehabilitate her, because the jury from the get-go had this he said, she said, quite literally, choice in front of them.
Yeah, and I think again that's what I was alluding to earlier when I said that there's just this question of whether it was a good trial strategy to put her credibility in question, especially as it goes to this the claim, Trump is making the claim that the sexual encounter in 2006 never happened. He's long made that claim. And when Justice Merchan was giving his ruling from the bench, he not only mentioned that the defense opened the door from the very beginning, where in opening statements they put this issue into play, but he also made the point that there were a lot of objections. He kind of mentioned this the other day as well, but he made the point that there were a lot of objections that were waived basically because as the prosecution was eliciting some of the testimony that the defense was complaining about. So things, for example, like whether Trump was wearing a condom when Daniels and Trump had sex. Daniels said that he was not. That had been specifically elicited by the prosecution on Tuesday, and it went unobjected to by Necklace. And Justice Merchan had this really remarkable moment in which he said, I, for the life of me, cannot understand why Miss Necklace did not object to that question, because he said, I do agree that yes, that probably should not have come in. I wouldn't have wanted it to come in. And he said, and later when there were objections, I sustained almost all of them, but I do not understand why that went unobjected to. So it was kind of a remarkable moment. Although I will say, in Susan Necklace's defense, every advocate misses at some point an objection that they wish that they would have made. And so it might have just been a moment in which she kind of accidentally missed it, but it nevertheless seemed to be something. It's just one example of a few other points that went by in which he couldn't fathom why the defense had not, put up more of a fight. So I thought that was interesting. But ultimately it seemed to come back to him for the fact that the door was opened within opening statements, and that many of these details that were elicited did indeed go to the question of whether or not Stormy Daniels was credible when she made the claims about the sexual encounter, and it went to corroborating that story.
I'll also say one other open question though that the judge seemed to get, but I'm not convinced yet that the jury gets. The other aspect of, I think, the defense's argument was that why are we here talking about an event, a sexual encounter in 2006 for a business records case? After a testimony today of where we heard about, a possum and paranormal activity and tarot cards, like I think that's actually an open question as to whether the jury is understands that this speaks to the intent element of the crime. The judge, I think, agrees with the prosecution that it does, but I am, we'll see if the jury does.
And here's the connection to that the defense counsel made that I actually do think is very interesting, although I don't think it's relevant necessarily to the motion for mistrial. They made the argument that even though all of these details were elicited, the story was told, there was no attempt to really connect it to what was actually known about her story at the time that the non-disclosure agreement was entered into. And that's important for the reasons that I spoke about earlier, which is that Stormy Daniels has a very credible story that she's told about this encounter and about how it involved this power imbalance and how that connects to the narrative about the Access Hollywood video. But all of that really only matters is if at the time this scheme was concocted, there was some kind of, knowledge about what the details of the story involved in some way. And so I thought that was an interesting moment, and it seems like it's going to be maybe something that comes up later in maybe closing arguments or that kind of thing. But we will see.
So we have 5 minutes left. I do want to make sure that we give the other witnesses who testified today their time to shine. So who else did we hear from?
Well, I thought the most interesting one was Westerhout. I'm forgetting her first name.
Madeleine.
Madeleine Westerhout.
I think it's Westerhout.
Westerhout. She was the TLDR. She was in 2017 an executive assistant to Trump, as well as eventually the coordinator of Oval Office coordinator. She sat very close to Trump. I think the upshot of her testimony and the big takeaway is that she was there almost to counterbalance the portrait that Daniels painted, is how I took it. She gave an extremely sympathetic portrait of Trump, despite being fired from her job for what she calls an indiscretion. She had essentially, said some things that she said she shouldn't have during a dinner which she thought was off the record, for which she was fired. She then wrote a book which was very flattering to Trump, whom she said was an amazing boss, very respectful. She told these sort of touching stories of how Trump would call his wife from the Oval Office to the residence, saying like, "Come to the window," and she could see him across the way from the Oval Office, and he would call her when he was boarding Air Force One, even though, of course, she knew his whereabouts at all times, but it was still just like a nice gesture. Whether or not, after everything we've heard, that's actually going to affect the jury, I don't know. But she did break down. I actually thought she was genuine. Maybe I'm gullible, but she, I thought it was, I thought that she believed what she said, and she actually regretted what happened in 2017.
Yeah, and all of that kind of raised the question of why did the prosecution then call her? And the reason,
I was gonna say, Tyler, you're making her sound like a defense witness.
Yeah. and the reason is because, well, first she can speak to kind of how it is that these checks got from the Trump organization to the White House, and then delivering them to Trump for him to sign. All of that, these kinds of nuts and bolts things of actually kind of connecting that Trump actually did sign some of these checks and that he was sent checks and all of that. But there's also other things that involve, for example, emails in which Westerhout, what did we decide it was? Westerhout was able to help the prosecution get into evidence by saying, like, yes, this is an email that I sent to Rona Graff, for example. And it'd be things like, showing that Trump was really into even small financial transactions. He was involved in the details of that. For example, there was one invoice from a golf club that Trump was a part of pre-presidency, and Rona Graff from the Trump organization sent him an invoice with some of these checks that he got sent, and she wrote on it, Mr. Trump, let me know if you want to continue your fees, or what should I do with this? And then in his classic felt tip black marker, wrote in like all capital letters like pay, and sent it back to Rona Graff. And then there was another episode in which it was about a frame that Trump wanted or something from Tiffany's. He wanted to get something framed, and so there was discussion about whether or not he would want to spend that much money, meaning $650, which certainly is not the $35,000 a month that he paid Michael Cohen. And they had a discussion about whether they should ask him if he wanted to spend that much money on something. Some of that might have not been the most helpful testimony, especially about the picture frame thing, because Westerhout, who seemed to be very much in Trump's corner, said, that's the only thing I can remember ever involving him on. And it just was because he had, particular desire to have this certain thing framed because it was special to him. It was something to do with his mother, I believe. There are times when she was maybe a little bit of a complicated witness, but ultimately they were able to get in some of these details that involve other things like Michael Cohen was in his contacts, Alan Weisselberg, he was close to Alan Weisselberg, and then also that he had a meeting with Cohen on January at some point in 2017 that I think will come up later.
So before I let you go, I want to ask, do we have any sense of what's going to happen tomorrow?
I don't know. Did you have, maybe we'll hear from Rona Graff. I'm not sure.
Well, we already heard from Rona Graff. I don't think you were there
Yeah.
that day, but and we've already heard from
Oh, no,
Rona
sorry,
Graff.
not Rona
Yes,
Graff.
I
I'm
think
forgetting her name.
well, we don't know what will happen tomorrow. I do think that that we are going to get a number of witnesses tomorrow, because I think that we might be in more of
We will not be getting
documents.
Karen McDougal. That was another. I
Yes.
think
Oh,
item
that's
that
right.
came out.
Yes,
That
we
that
know what we
people
will
will
not be
not
getting.
recall Karen McDougal will not call, but we also will probably hear briefly from the paralegal Longstreet, who will be recalled to introduce some more evidence as well.
That
The
is
woman with the world's
thinking.
strangest job.
Sorry, everyone. It's been a long day of court.
Yeah.
We were there actually longer than we usually are, because Justice Mershon usually lets people out at 4:30, but we were there until 5. One thing I will say in terms of future scheduling, we learned today from Justice Mershon that we are either on time or ahead of schedule for the sequence of the prosecution's case, at least. And there was also an interesting comment from Blanche that was a little bit garbled. I couldn't quite understand what he was saying. But at one point, when he was arguing about the gag order modification motion they made, he said something to the effect of the only witness left is Michael Cohen.
Something like the only witness left subject to the gag order is Michael Cohen, and then he kind of stopped himself and backtracked. So it was a little hard to understand what he was getting at there.
Well,
Because all witnesses are everyone is subject to the gag order. So it kind of implied that, is Michael Cohen the only witness left? I don't think that's the case. We know that there are certain campaign finance experts, for example, who will at some point testify. That's expected. There's a number of other people who have come up or been mentioned that might testify, maybe Keith Schiller, Trump's bodyguard, for example, people like that. So we'll see, Quinta. We just don't know.
So I'll end things there, because I know we have things to do. Anna Bauer, Tyler McBrien, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for watching. If you want to support Lawfare's coverage of Trump trials and watch this without ads, you can become a